This image is etched into the retinas of everyone who looks at a world map, a thin blue thread neatly cutting through the yellow expanse of the desert, a symbol of global logistics, familiar and easily understood.
It seems as though this waterway has always been here, naturally connecting the continents.
But this thin line can be deceiving. If you stand at the water's edge, you won't smell the freshness of the sea, but the scent of diesel fuel and scorching sand. Behind the facade of seamless transit lies a history of endless struggle against the physical limits of the earth. This is not a natural strait, but an open, bleeding wound on the body of a continent. This canal has bankrupted entire empires. Because of it, global wars began and world markets collapsed. For years, trapped fleets rotted in its murky waters. Every expansion of this channel was paid for with workers' bones and burned-up capital. What we see today is not a transport artery. It is a complex mechanical valve regulating the blood pressure of the global economy, an extremely complex system maintaining a balance between water, sand, and the colossal weight of steel. It is an instrument of pure power disguised as a geographical feature. The illusion of a safe route is created for those who do not see the other side of the process. We look at logistics, but what stands before us is a machine of pure exploitation. It is a mechanism that grinds down the landscape to maintain the speed of capital's movement, and it demands constant, colossal sacrifices. By the end of this story, you will understand the true nature of this blue thread. You will see why the riverbed is forced to grow constantly, devouring its own banks. You will learn why saving the canal always costs more than building it. The illusion of a simple waterway will be shattered forever. Control over this water has always been illusory.
Every ruler has tried to subjugate this flow, to dictate terms to the world.
And every time geology and physics struck back, the system took revenge on those who forgot its artificial nature. The scale of this structure was miscalculated from the start. Each new era demanded that more and more cargo be forced through the narrow bottleneck. The riverbed creaked under the pressure of steel hulls that only grew larger. Engineers had to cut into the earth again and again. But to understand the scale of this trap, we must go back to the beginning, to the starting point, when there were no tankers and no global crises. There were no radars on the shores, and the seabed was not littered with debris. Only dead, motionless land. Before us lies the scorching Suez Isthmus of the mid-19th century, a completely hostile environment, devoid of fresh water and shade, a perfectly flat barrier of salt, clay, and sand, and a man with paper blueprints determined to split this monolith in two. The isthmus was impenetrable to humans and deadly dangerous. It is not just sand, it is a compressed mixture of gypsum, clay, and salt. The summer heat here kills living things within a few hours of working in the open sun.
The geography itself was an ideal defense against any engineering ambitions.
Ferdinand de Lesseps was not an engineer. He was a diplomat with a maniacal idea and a gift for persuasion. He sold the ruler of Egypt on the concept of prosperity through digging a trench between two seas. It was a pure paper abstraction, detached from the physical reality of the ground. The British Empire immediately recognized the threat. A shorter route to India in French hands would shatter their global monopoly. London applied diplomatic pressure, attempting to strangle the project financially. Not a single British bank lent a single pound to this construction project. The project began to falter even before the first shovel hit the ground. The funds raised in France were critically insufficient to purchase state-of-the-art equipment. The volume of earth that needed to be excavated exceeded all conceivable estimates. The math collided with the density of the soil. Lesseps's plan called for the use of modern steam engines, but due to budget shortages, the machines remained on the blueprints. In reality, there was nothing to dig this gigantic trench with. A technological triumph turned into a return to ancient methods. To save the company, Lesseps struck a deal with the Egyptian government. Instead of coal and steel, he received human labor. The ruler of Egypt conscripted tens of thousands of peasants into forced labor for the construction. The project turned into a giant concentration camp under the scorching sun. It was a decision born of desperation. People were to replace steam excavators. They began digging the trench with pickaxes, hoes, and their bare hands. They carried the sand away in woven baskets on their own backs. Engineering ingenuity crumbled in the face of geology. The canal walls constantly crumbled, forcing people to dig the same spot twice. The excavation plan ignored the groundwater, which turned the clay into a heavy slurry. The scale of the task slowly crushed its creators. The project's structure proved ill-suited to withstand the environment. Every mile completed demanded ever greater human resources. The logistics of supplying drinking water were stretched to the limit. Workers drank dirty water from makeshift canals. The diplomats' ambitions clashed with the law of conservation of mass. The Earth resisted brute physical force. It became clear that breaking through this monolith with bare hands would be impossible. The project came to a halt just one step away from complete failure. Nature began to exact its toll for the intrusion. A cholera epidemic broke out in the workers' camps, decimating entire sectors of the construction site. People died of dehydration and dysentery right at the bottom of the future canal. The stench of decay mingled with dust and salt. Under international pressure, forced labor was abolished. Lesseps lost his main and only resource. Construction ground to a halt, leaving behind only a pitiful ditch in the desert. This was the first systemic crisis that nearly buried the project. Salvation came in the form of radical mechanization. French engineers hastily designed giant steam-powered dredgers. These were monstrous floating factories of iron, blackening the sky with smoke. The coal-fired machines plunged their steel buckets into the bottom. The sound of the desert changed forever.
Instead of the shouts of overseers, there was the roar of pistons and the screech of metal against stone.
The machines scooped out tons of mud in a single cycle, dumping it onto the shore through long chutes. Human flesh gave way to steam and machine oil. This saved the canal but created a new problem. The machines required coal, fresh water, and constant repairs in isolated conditions. The logistics of the construction became 10 times more complicated. The cost of every meter dug skyrocketed. The canal's body began to take shape, but that shape came at a heavy cost. The El Ghassour rocky plateau stood in the builder's way. The excavators' bucket teeth shattered against the hard rock. They had to use tons of explosives, shaking the geological plates. A decade of grueling labor was coming to an end. The two seas were finally connected by a stream of murky water. But this was not a victory of reason over nature.
It was a victory of brute mechanical force and colossal debt.
The financial burden of the project became unbearable. Lesseps's company was on the verge of bankruptcy. They cut corners everywhere, reducing the final width and depth of the channel. The canal was completed, but it was critically narrow. From an engineering standpoint, it was a compromise. The builders were in a hurry to open the canal to traffic so they could start collecting tolls. They left the problem of sand siltation for the future. A time bomb was embedded in the very geometry of the channel. Physically, the canal existed, but it was too weak. It resembled a baby forced to do the work of a giant. Water filled the trench, hiding beneath it the traces of a decade of agony. The stage was set for the premiere. The opening was celebrated with imperial pomp. Yachts of European monarchs, salutes, and a Verdi opera written especially for the occasion. The picture in the press was flawless. The world celebrated the conquest of Africa and the triumph of progress. But behind the scenes of this celebration, panic was brewing. Even before the official start, several ships had run aground. The depth of the channel did not match the stated specifications. Sand from the banks was relentlessly sliding back into the water. The ceremonial convoy proceeded with constant delays. Ship captains watched in horror as the sandy walls closed in too closely. The slightest error by the helmsman led to an accident.
The illusion of a wide waterway vanished at the very first collision with reality.
After the guests departed, a harsh financial winter set in. Revenues from ship passage turned out to be catastrophically lower than Lesseps's estimates. Most captains still preferred the safe route around Africa. The narrow and shallow channel aroused distrust among freight carriers. They tried to balance the books by sharply raising rates, but this only scared away the last remaining customers. The company found itself in a debt spiral, lacking the funds even for basic dredging. The system began to devour itself. Egypt became the main victim of this collapse. Ruler Ismail Pasha had incurred colossal debts to European banks for the sake of this project. Interest on the loans exceeded the country's entire revenue. The financial burden had reached a critical point. Egypt found itself bankrupt because of someone else's illusion. In a desperate attempt to save the economy, the government put its stake in the company up for sale. That was the moment when economic weakness turned into a loss of sovereignty. The canal went from being a source of income to a noose. The infrastructure began to deteriorate.
Dredgers rusted on the banks, while the sand reclaimed the land, meter by meter.
The channel rapidly silted up, threatening to close the passage even to light vessels. The outward glamour was finally worn away, exposing a rusty skeleton. This was the price paid for the initial compromise. By cutting corners on the width and the reinforcement of the banks, the builders had doomed the project to a perpetual struggle. The canal could not exist autonomously. It required a constant infusion of capital that neither France nor Egypt possessed anymore. The shutdown of this lifeline seemed inevitable. The canal's structure was physically unprepared to survive in the real world, but this weakness attracted a predator. In London, they realized that the time was ripe to strike. The British Empire acted swiftly and cold-bloodedly. Prime Minister Disraeli secretly took out a massive loan from the Rothschilds. Within a few hours, he bought a controlling stake in bankrupt Egypt. The canal changed hands without a single shot being fired. From a French commercial venture, the strait became a British military asset. London instantly recognized the strategic importance of this waterway. It was no longer a trade route, but a vital artery of the empire. The pulse of India now beat in Egypt. But owning the papers did not grant full control over the land. A rebellion against foreign influence broke out in Egypt. British ships entered the port of Alexandria and began bombarding the city. Protecting the investment required the use of heavy artillery. British troops landed on the shore and occupied the canal zone. The illusion of neutral waters was shattered by tank tracks and boots. The artery was encircled by a steel ring of military bases. The facility became a full-fledged instrument of the occupying power. The load on the system changed dramatically. Now, not only merchant ships, but also heavy cruisers were passing through the canal. The iron hulls of the warships required greater depth. Britain began the forced widening of the channel. They began blasting and dredging the bottom again. Saving the canal from silting up once more required colossal efforts. Reinforcing the banks demanded concrete and massive steel sheet piles. The original simplicity of the earthen trench vanished completely. The canal turned into a fortified corridor. Observation towers and artillery batteries sprang up along the banks. The water became a militarized zone, where every maneuver was controlled from land. The canal lost its freedom, becoming a hostage to geopolitics. The diplomatic agreement of 1888 declared the canal open to all. It was yet another paper illusion of stability. In reality, the keys to the gates lay in the pocket of a British general. Any unwelcome fleet could be stopped under the pretext of quarantine. The body of the canal was getting used to its new, rigid form. It was encased in armor and strict military regulations. But along with its power, the vulnerability of the entire empire grew. Dependence on this narrow slit in the sands became absolute. London tied its fate to the geometry of the canal's channel. Any threat to the canal now meant a threat to the very existence of the British Empire. A steel grip squeezed Egypt's throat, but at the same time chained Britain itself to it. The artery became the superpower's weak spot. The 20th century brought unprecedented pressure to bear on the canal. Global conflicts turned it into the primary strategic target for all warring parties. During World War I, Ottoman troops desperately tried to break through to the sandy shores. They wanted to sever this vital transport artery of the British Empire at any cost. The defenders were forced to turn the once peaceful waterway into a veritable front line. The canal was quickly and menacingly bristling with heavy machine guns and kilometers of razor wire. The scorching desert became the scene of brutal and incredibly grueling land battles. Soldiers sat for days on end in deep trenches under the blazing African sun. Guarding this massive facility required the constant presence of thousands of well-armed infantrymen. British artillery regularly shelled the advancing enemy columns directly from the western bank. Attempts to quickly cross the water barrier on pontoons ended in terrible human losses. The harsh natural environment punished the soldiers with thirst and sandstorms no less than enemy bullets. Hundreds of anti-aircraft guns tried in vain to defend the night sky over the water. Powerful searchlights constantly cut through the darkness in search of Nazi military aircraft. The work of the civilian lock personnel turned into a true daily heroic feat. People rebuilt the destroyed fortifications right under the howl of falling heavy bombs. No one could guarantee the safe delivery of cargo to its destination ports. But even this terrible conflict could not completely stop the movement of iron ships. However, the main historical challenge was not the war at all, but the long period of peace that followed. After the long-awaited calm set in, the global merchant fleet grew at a monstrous and unprecedented pace. The devastated economies of many countries required enormous quantities of cheap raw materials and construction supplies. With each passing year, cargo ships became significantly longer, heavier, and wider. The emergence of giant oil supertankers completely changed all the familiar rules of maritime transport. The engineering parameters of the old narrow channel were fatally out of step with the enormous dimensions of the new technology. Navigating such enormous ships demanded incredible skill from the local, weary pilots. The steel hulls of the heavy steamers constantly and dangerously scraped against the steep, sandy slopes. Huge metal propellers churned up thick clouds of viscous gray silt from the seabed. It was a truly grueling race to the finish between the forces of geology and the global economy. The insatiable desert constantly sought to reclaim its rightful ancestral territory. Every extra foot of a ship's draft required the mandatory dredging of millions of cubic meters of wet soil. The financial cost of maintaining the system's uninterrupted operation was rising at an alarming geometric rate. The fatigue of the old sturdy concrete and coastal protective structures was becoming absolutely critical. Engineers constantly warned politicians of an impending, inevitable major technological disaster. Alongside the physical deterioration of the infrastructure, intense political pressure was also mounting rapidly. Proud Egypt demanded, ever more loudly and confidently, that control over its national territory be returned to it. Foreign control of the country's primary economic resource was perceived as a terrible historical humiliation. The constant presence of British armed forces on the shores provoked the fury of a new generation of Arabs. Mass labor strikes and violent student protests regularly erupted across the country. Tensions surrounding this narrow waterway were constantly simmering, ready to explode at any moment. This vital global waterway had swollen catastrophically from endless cargo and political ambitions. The entire complex hydraulic system was operating at the very limit of its original strength. The foreign company's executives completely ignored any sensible reserves of technical reliability. From the outside, all this endless movement of huge ships looked like a true triumph of logistics. But from the inside, it was a terrifyingly overheated old steam boiler with a valve jammed shut. Investors reaped colossal profits, completely turning a blind eye to the enormous hidden risks. The old order was cracking at the seams under the powerful pressure of the national liberation movement. The authorities of the great powers continued to naively believe in their complete impunity and geopolitical invulnerability. They utterly refused to notice the obvious signs of the global catastrophe looming over them. It took just one decisive move to bring down this entire outdated structure forever. This bold political maneuver was destined to shake the very foundations of the global capitalist economy, and that move was made by a man from Cairo. President Gamal Abdel Nasser struck at the West's most vulnerable and painful spot. During his famous speech, he uttered a prearranged secret code word. He loudly announced the complete and unconditional nationalization of the Suez Canal Company. The jubilant crowd in the square erupted in deafening cries of absolute triumph and genuine joy. The expensive paper shares of the powerful corporation instantly lost all meaning and real value. Egypt had physically and legally taken possession of the keys to the most vital global transit system. London and Paris reacted to this news with the aggressive reflex of a wounded predator. Politicians in Europe could not come to terms with the loss of such a colossal source of steady income. Secret diplomatic meetings very quickly escalated into a concrete plan for a large-scale military invasion. Together with Israel, they launched a swift and brutal armed intervention into a foreign sovereign territory. Air raid sirens once again shattered the silence of peaceful Egyptian cities with their piercing wails. Foreign heavy bombers methodically and mercilessly destroyed vital state infrastructure. Columns of the aggressor's tanks raced across the scorching sands of the Sinai Peninsula. Powerful explosions shook residential neighborhoods in the immediate vicinity of the waterway. The sudden landing of armed paratroopers in the canal zone plunged the entire region back into chaos. Local garrisons put up a desperate fight, suffering heavy casualties under heavy machine gun fire. War had returned once again to these long-suffering shores, bringing with it death and destruction. The international community watched the rapid escalation of this bloody conflict with great horror. The global market immediately experienced a deep and incredibly painful economic shock. Cheap oil from the Middle East ceased to flow into the industrial ports of Western Europe. This event instantly caused genuine panic and an acute fuel shortage among the general population. Drivers stood in kilometer-long lines for gasoline, cursing short-sighted politicians. Britain suddenly realized its absolute helplessness without this short transit pipeline. The empire suffered a crushing defeat not on the battlefield, but before a simple flooded tugboat. The two major nuclear superpowers were extremely outraged by such blatant unilateral action on the part of their allies. Under incredibly intense pressure from the US and the USSR, the frightened interventionists hastily retreated. Politicians in London lost their posts because of this disastrous and shameful military adventure. The Egyptian people took to the streets to celebrate their hard-won but absolutely unquestionable political victory. But the physical clearing of the blocked riverbed took many long and grueling months of hard work. International experts racked their brains over how to quickly remove this massive underwater debris. Rescue teams from all over the world arrived in Egypt to carry out this unique operation. Huge specialized floating cranes pulled the debris from the bottom of the canal piece by piece. Divers worked in incredibly dangerous conditions of zero visibility and strong underwater currents. Egypt definitively and triumphantly proved its full state sovereignty to the entire world. The proud republic forced the former colonial empires to respect its legitimate national interests. But as a historical price to pay, the young government inherited a territory that was practically a minefield. High geopolitical tension in this hot region did not disappear even after the troops withdrew. The banks of the artificial river remained an incredibly dangerous potential front line. There, weary soldiers stared at one another every day through the cold lenses of their optical sights. The air above the water's surface was literally saturated with constant anxiety and the anticipation of a new war. The calm transit waters no longer smelled of the fresh sea, but of acrid gunpowder and burning fuel. Military patrol boats regularly cut through the waves, carefully guarding the borders of the sovereign state. The crews of civilian vessels navigated this dangerous stretch in life jackets in constant fear. Any accidental spark could ignite a new large-scale international conflagration in the scorching desert. Diplomats worked around the clock, desperately trying to prevent yet another escalation of armed conflict. This monumental engineering feat had become a hostage to the political and military ambitions of others. No thick concrete walls could protect it from human hatred and greed. The brief era of fragile peace had reached its inevitable and terrifying logical conclusion. The clanking of the tracks of approaching heavy armored divisions could already be clearly heard in the air. The catastrophe was utterly inevitable, and it was already impossible to save the transport artery. The next blow was bound to stop the heart for good. The Six-Day War turned the canal from a transport artery into a dead moat. Israeli tanks reached the eastern bank, while Egyptian troops entrenched themselves on the western bank. The water became a front line, a neutral zone that could not be crossed. Transit came to a halt instantly. Egypt once again mined the fairway and blew up the bridges. But this time, 15 international merchant ships found themselves trapped inside the channel. They dropped anchor in the Great Bitter Lake, unable to reach either sea. The traps snapped shut with a deadly grip. These ships went down in history as the Yellow Fleet. The desert quickly began to swallow them up. A fine yellow dust covered the decks in a thick layer. The sailors found themselves hostages to frozen time in a political impasse. The canal died. For 8 long years, all traffic ceased completely. The sand, no longer held back by dredgers, rapidly filled the channel. The water bloomed with algae, and the banks became overgrown with wild shrubs and minefields. Nature began to reclaim its body. The engineering triumph dissolved into the primeval landscape. It seemed that the canal's story was finally over. The metal rotted, and global logistics learned to live without this artery. The global economy had to adapt to the pain. Shipping companies once again routed their fleets around the Cape of Good Hope. This detour was longer and cost billions of dollars in losses, but it revealed one critical detail of modern capitalism. Limited by the canal's width, ship owners had previously been unable to build vessels larger than a certain size. The closure of the waterway removed this physical constraint. Engineers began designing giant supertankers that did not need to squeeze through the Suez. Economies of scale offset the longer route. When the canal was finally cleared of mines and dredged in 1975, it had become obsolete. The structure, freed from 8 years of paralysis, was too weak. The world had moved on, creating steel monsters that simply wouldn't fit in the old channel. The canal reopened, but in its former state, it was of no use to anyone. The cost of saving it was once again astronomical. To win back customers, Egypt had to launch an unprecedented project to deepen and widen the canal. The old trench essentially had to be dug anew. This was not modernization, but a desperate attempt to keep up with the scale of the times. The canal was saved, but its new form became daunting. It turned into a bottomless pit requiring endless funding. Dependence on transit fees forced Egypt to take on any engineering risks. The cycle of overburdening began anew. The next 40 years became an era of permanent surgery. Container ships grew at a mutational pace, increasing in size every few years. Ship capacity grew from thousands to tens of thousands of containers. The canal's structure was straining at the seams, trying to accommodate these leviathans. Shores were cut away. The bottom was blasted and dredged. Billions of cubic meters of soil were continuously extracted. But the ships still sailed one after another with minimal clearance under the keel. Any technical error on board meant disaster for the entire system. Capacity had hit a hard limit. The single-track section of the route forced convoys to wait their turn for days on end. Time is money, and the canal had begun to burn through time. The strain on the logistics hub had become critical. In 2014, the authorities made a radical decision. They launched a project to build a parallel channel at the narrowest point. The project, costing over $8 billion, was completed in a single frantic year. The Earth was torn apart with terrifying ferocity. It was an attempt to cheat geometry and time. Dredgers from all over the world were herded to a single point to dig out a second artery. Work proceeded around the clock, gnawing into the hard rock with fanatical speed. This was not planning. It was an act of desperation and ambition. The new channel was opened with traditional fanfare. Two-way traffic reduced waiting times. The authorities declared a definitive victory over geography. The illusion of complete control was once again sold to the world. But this salvation merely masked vulnerability. The width of the new channel remained limited nonetheless, and shipping company owners took this as a signal to build even more gigantic vessels. They began producing mega container ships that barely fit even in the new channel. The system became a hostage to its own expansion. The wider the canal became, the larger the ships were built. It is a race in which geology will always lose to engineering, but the physics of solid bodies has not disappeared. The canal's body has swollen to unnatural proportions. The horizons are no longer visible along the banks. They are obscured by the steel walls of passing ships, as tall as skyscrapers. The desert wind beats against these giant sails made of containers. The pressure on the tugboat's wheels has increased many times over. This massive infrastructure operates with zero margin for error. There are no backup options. Global trade has entrusted its fate to a single bottleneck, and one day, this gamble was bound to backfire. Recall March 2021. The wind over the Sinai Peninsula shifted direction. The 400-meter container ship Ever Given lost control. Within minutes, the massive steel hull had spun across the channel. The ship's bow crashed into the sandy shore with a crunch. The stern was firmly wedged against the opposite bank. The artery was blocked not by bombs or mines, but by the simple physics of wind and mass. The mechanism that had been built over a century and a half came to a halt. Every hour of this downtime cost the world hundreds of millions of dollars. The line of ships stretched for hundreds of miles. Satellite images showed a tiny excavator hopelessly digging at the earth beneath the ship's gigantic bow. It was the quintessence of humanity's arrogance in the face of scale. The canal had withstood wars and revolutions, but capitulated to its own greed. We built ships so large that they became bigger than the system itself. Rescuing the vessel required incredible effort in lunar tides. When the monster was finally refloated, the world breathed a sigh of relief but understood nothing. The outward stability of this passage is a carefully maintained myth. What began as a trench in the sand has turned into an artificial life support system. It is overloaded, worn out, and operating at the limits of the laws of physics. Every expansion merely postpones a new collapse. Look again at that blue line on the map. You no longer see just water. You see the colossal weight of steel hulls. You smell the scent of billions burned and blood spilled. Those in power are trying to subjugate nature, pushing the boundaries of what is possible. But everything has its limits. The earth, cut through by lesseps, continues its invisible struggle. The sand crumbles, the riverbed silting up, and the wind blows as strongly as ever. The symbol of globalization has survived, but it has transformed into a trap. The world has become so dependent on this waterway that it can no longer afford to lose it. We are chained to this place. We have become slaves to our own infrastructure. The illusion of eternity continues its journey through the desert. Convoys follow one after another, burning tons of fuel oil. But beneath the smooth surface of the water lies a coiled spring, and no one knows when it will spring again. This is not just a canal, it is a monument to how far we are willing to go for the sake of speed, and how dearly we pay for trying to outsmart the earth itself. The blue line on the map is a scar that will never heal.